All right, everyone, get ready. Today we are diving deep into one of the most talked about battles in history, Thermopylae. And believe me, get ready to have your assumptions challenged, because what we think we know about this clash, well, it's often more Hollywood than history.
It's true. This isn't just about memorizing names and dates. We're going beyond the myths to understand why this fight against seemingly impossible odds still fascinates us all these centuries later.
Exactly. We are talking 480 BC. The Persian Empire, led by Xerxes, is on the move, and they are a force to be reckoned with.
And they made it very clear what they expected from the Greeks. When Xerxes demanded earth and water, it wasn't a friendly request.
More like a threat, right? Surrender or else.
Exactly. It was a symbolic way of demanding submission, and crucially, both Athens and Sparta chose to defy that demand.
Which leads us to the showdown at Thermopylae. Now, I've always pictured this super narrow mountain pass, barely enough room to swing a sword. How accurate is that image?
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. While there's definitely a narrow pass, the terrain is much more varied than you might think. Imagine a coastal plain, then the pass itself, wider than it's often shown, but then you've got this mountain path overlooking it all, and even hot springs in the mix.
Wow, so a lot more going on than I imagined. It sounds like a challenging environment for everyone, even before the fighting starts. I bet the heat was brutal, especially since the Greeks and Persians came from such different climates.
Absolutely. Fighting in that kind of environment adds a whole other layer of difficulty to an already intense situation.
Okay, so let's talk about the defenders. It wasn't just 300 Spartans holding the line like in the movies, right?
Yeah.
There were other Greeks fighting alongside them.
You're absolutely right. Herodotus, who wrote about this battle, talks about a force of several thousand Greeks present at Thermopylae. Another ancient writer, Diodorus, gives slightly different figures.
So which one is right?
It's not about one being definitively right. It actually highlights a key challenge for historians. Even for famous events, getting precise numbers can be really difficult. But even focusing on just the Spartans, it's clear there were more than those famous 300.
Okay, so who else was fighting in the Spartan ranks?
Along with the Spartan citizens, called Spartiates, you had the Perioeci. They were free non-citizens, but they were still trained for battle. And then there were the Helots.
The Elites, those were.
Essentially, they were owned by the Spartan state. Their exact role in the battle is debated, that some historians think they served as armed support, which would have significantly boosted Spartan strength.
Wow, so even within this incredibly disciplined Spartan society, you had a less discussed group playing a potentially key role in their military. But knowing the Persians vastly outnumbered them, why choose to fight at Thermopylae at all?
And that's where Greek strategy gets really interesting. The terrain, even if it was wider than imagined, still forced the Persians into a narrower front. This meant their massive numerical advantage was less effective. It's a classic example of using terrain as what we today would call a force multiplier. Your strength isn't just how many soldiers you have, it's how well you utilize them.
So it's like that saying, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. But in this case, the Greeks were saying, okay, let's have this gunfight, but we're doing it in a phone booth where all those extra guns you have don't really matter.
Exactly. A bold strategy, to say the least. And that brings us to the leader of those Spartans, Leonidas. Everyone's heard the mole on Labe, right?
Come and get them. Pretty badass.
Definitely. But knowing they were likely outmatched, why stay and fight? It's one thing to talk tough, but facing down that massive Persian army.
It makes you wonder what was going through their heads. Was it a suicide mission, or were they trying to buy time for the other Greeks?
That's the prevailing theory, a delaying tactic. Every hour, every day they held back the Persians at Thermopylae was another hour, another day for the rest of the Greek forces to regroup, fortify, live to fight another day, especially given the situation at sea.
Right, because this was a land battle. But the Greeks knew that ultimately control of the sea was going to be crucial.
Exactly. Leonidas wasn't just buying time on land, he was giving the Greek navy a fighting chance. But, I mean, you have to imagine, it wasn't just a cold, calculated decision. Put yourself in Leonidas' sandals.
Oh, man.
Knowing that your choice means life or death, not just for you, but potentially for all of Greece, that's a heavy burden.
It's mind-blowing, the weight of that decision. And it wasn't just Spartans who chose to stay, right? The Thespians, their entire fighting force, went down with them. What made them sacrifice so much?
The Thespians are a really poignant example of how individual cities got caught up in this massive conflict. Geographically, they were right in the Persians' path.
Yeah.
Whether they fought at Thermopylae or not, they might have faced destruction anyway.
So maybe for them, it was less about strategy and more about going down fighting on their own terms. Talk about courage.
Right.
But it gets even more complex because you also have those Thebans who stayed with the Spartans.
Right, and according to Plutarch, they weren't hostages, which is interesting.
So why did they stay?
Well, Plutarch, who was writing centuries later, pointed out that if they were just hostages, Xerxes would have held on to them as bargaining chips when the other Greeks retreated. He figured they were probably political dissidents.
Meaning they were on the wrong side of their own city's politics, and this was, what, their best chance at survival, even if it meant defying their own people?
It's possible.
That's wild. You don't see that kind of complexity in the movies.
It just goes to show, even within this huge historical battle, there were countless individual stories, each with motivations that we can only guess at.
Absolutely. So we know the Greeks lost at Thermopylae. But was it a complete defeat? I mean, those Spartans, they didn't go down without a fight. Did they at least make the Persians pay for every inch of ground?
Oh, absolutely. While a Persian victory, Thermopylae was anything but a walk in the park.
So a hard-fought victory for the Persians, but a costly one, no doubt. What happened next? Did they just, march on, figuring, well, that was messy, but on to Athens?
It's easy to focus just on the land battle, but remember, there was a whole other conflict happening simultaneously at sea. And this is where that Greek strategy and the Spartan sacrifice becomes even more significant.
Because while those Spartans were holding the pass at Thermopylae, the Greek navy had time to prepare to face the Persians.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the psychological impact of Thermopylae. A demoralized Greek fleet, one that had just seen their comrades completely crushed, they might have folded quickly against the Persian navy.
But knowing those Spartans, along with the other Greeks, had made the Persians fight for every inch of ground.
It completely changed the narrative. Those stories of bravery, of defiance, even in the face of certain death, they spread throughout Greece. And remember, this was a culture that really valued honor and sacrifice. So Thermopylae, it became this rallying cry.
A testament to the fact that even the mighty Persians could be resisted, that they weren't invincible. It reminds us that history isn't always about who wins or loses on a particular day. It's about the stories we tell afterward, the legacies that inspire future generations.
You're absolutely right. Even Xerxes himself seemed really struck by the tenacity of the Greeks. Herodotus tells this fascinating story where Xerxes discovers that the Greeks hold these Olympic games, these competitions of sport and skill.
Oh yeah, I remember reading about that.
And Xerxes is completely baffled. He can't comprehend why anyone would compete just for glory, not for material rewards. He's flabbergasted.
What a contrast. It's like those two cultures had completely different worldviews. Like Xerxes couldn't grasp this idea of fighting for something more than just power or wealth.
Exactly. And it's not just Xerxes. Herodotus also recounts that one of the Persian generals, after seeing the Spartan dead at Thermopylae, remarked on how these were men who contend not for riches, but for honor.
Wow. Powerful stuff. So it seems like Thermopylae, it wasn't just about territory or resources. It was about a completely different way of looking at the world, a clash of ideologies almost.
Absolutely.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into Thermopylae, we're left with not just a battle, but a symbol. The Spartans and their allies, they become these almost larger-than-life figures. They embody this idea of courage, of sacrifice, of defending what you believe in, even against impossible odds.
It's a story that, for centuries, has resonated with people all over the world. And I think it makes us ask ourselves some really important questions. What truly matters? What are we willing to fight for? What would it take for us to make our own stand? Those are the real legacies of Thermopylae.
Incredibly well said. So next time you see those iconic images, those Spartan helmets, that defiant last stand against the Persian hordes, remember, it's not just history, it's a challenge, whispered across millennia, asking us, what will your Thermopylae be? Until next time, keep diving deep, everyone.